listeners, historically, town and gown was a phrase to refer to the complex relationship between the university and the surrounding community. It also highlighted the interdependence between the two. But as the concept has evolved over time, do our higher education institutions still hold obligations to others beyond tuition paying students? I'm Dr. Christy Ford, along with my guest, Dr. Matthew Rascoff, Vice Provost for Digital Education at Stanford. And we're diving into how that belief is being upheld and maybe even strengthened.
Welcome to Teach and Learn, a podcast for curious educators brought to you by D2L.
Each week, we'll meet some of the sharpest minds in the K-20 space. Sharpen your pencils, class is about to begin. So good to have you here today, Matthew.
Thank you so much for having me, Christy. What a pleasure.
Absolutely. I really am excited about the conversation today. We're going to really spend some time discussing pathways quite a bit in this episode. And so before we delve in and learn a lot more about what you're doing, your institution is doing, can you just provide a little bit more context by what you mean when you use this term so all the listeners are on the same page?
Sure. We use pathways to describe the process that students experience, but institutions and educational providers don't always think about. And it's the way we move through our lives educationally. And so, if you're a student and you're going from high school to college, that feels like an enormous canyon that you need to cross.
Yeah.
And, it's on one level, it's kind of the logic that we've defined for our system. But on another level, there's so much friction in it. And, what we mean when we say pathways is kind of redesigning the system in a more learner-centered way to take their perspective into account. So if you're in a kind of supply-side, provider-centered mindset, like that's their system, higher ed, this is our system, and like any gaps in between, that's kind of your job to figure out. But the way we think about it is more how a learner might, which is to say, like, this is all my education. And it's just kind of an artifice to say K-12 is one system and higher ed is another. Why did we decide that? That's kind of a historical artifact. The way people experience education is as a pathway. I think it's as a journey. And I think we, as designers of learning experiences, would do well to take that perspective more fully into account.
I love this approach because oftentimes, as you know, sometimes we have this chasm that we talk about exists between K-12 and higher ed. But if we're taking the learner's perspective of a pathway, it really makes the onus upon us as institutional providers, institutions, K-12 providers, to really break down those barriers. And I love the fact that you're using the word pathways, because we know that institutional sometimes mandates may think about one direct pathway, where in essence, there are a lot of different ways that our students come to our campuses. And so you wrote a piece where you discussed these pathways and how this obligation extends like just beyond Stanford, but to all private universities. And the piece, if I remember correctly, was entitled Private Universities Have Public Obligations. And listeners will link to this piece in our notes. But when you talk about this piece that you wrote, what's your argument in a nutshell, and what compelled you to write it?
Thank you. I mean, part of the argument, I think, is particular to Stanford, where I work, and part of it is about the private higher education sector, and I think part of it is about the broader higher education sector. And the idea is that we are, let me start with Stanford. We were founded as an institution that was dedicated to educating the sons and daughters of California. Part of what makes this place distinctive is that it was co-ed at the beginning. We had free tuition at the beginning of Stanford. For the first few decades as an institution, it was free tuition. And the founding grant of the university that was put in place, when we were established, says that we have to take into account the public good, and that we should be dedicated not just to the interests of our own community, to our own students and faculty, but to the broader public as well. And I think that's a very powerful idea. Not every institution has that history, but we do. And I think, as we look to the future, it's valuable to draw on the past. And it's important to understand institutional DNA and the roots as we try to design, for growth that is organic, that is not artificial. that will be biologically accepted, not biologically rejected by the organ and by the body. And I think that's drawing on history is one of my frameworks for thinking about innovation that is rooted, that does not feel that it's implanted, that does not feel like it's being imposed. So yeah, that's kind of the Stanford perspective. The broader higher education perspective, I would say, is that our sector, whether you're in a private university or a public university, is subsidized by the public. And if you are at a private institution, you're not paying taxes. Much of the funding comes from federal agencies. Everybody chips in for that. Every taxpayer in our country chips in for that. And I think it's not enough to say that we contribute to the commons, to the public good through the research enterprise. That's fine. That's kind of a common answer to that. It's absolutely true. I think that's necessary, but not sufficient. And I think on the educational side of what we do, we also have an obligation to contribute to the public. And the selectivity of institutions, we're not designed for that. Nobody really wanted that. And I think we need to find ways to redesign and to circumvent some of the bottlenecks that we've imposed in the admissions process to provide more educational public goods.
I really love this conversation because too often we talk about public versus private, and there is this sense that sometimes just rhetoric around elitism and not focusing on the common good. So I appreciate your focus and feedback specific to Stanford, but then talking about the ecosystem as a whole, that we all collectively have this responsibility. And hearing about Stanford's DNA around educational access, I really was reminded of the co-ed piece. I just hadn't remembered that piece of this conversation. And so as we think about the concessions that Stanford made in its history, I think one of the things that I remember from the conversations and looking at some of the historical data is Jane's Stanford solution was to allow learners to take classes without even becoming Stanford students.
Exactly.
And so, that was one way the institution could maintain its admission standards and support the mission. And so
Exactly.
I guess I want to talk to you more about online and given your experiences, how do you see this modality helping to support these various college pathways that you've talked about?
So when I started here in the fall of 2021, I launched a new team called Stanford Digital Education. And we are in the central administration reporting to the provost. And we do mission-driven digital learning at Stanford. And so we are the central office that coordinates the efforts across the schools. But we have a mandate to rethink the goal and to position learning opportunities for those who've been historically underserved by higher education. And the way we've thought about that is to build this program that's focused on low-income high schools across the country. We use this criterion of Title I. It's sort of a federal criterion that defines a free and reduced lunch percentage of 40% or more. And we built a model that actually taps in to that provisional student category that you described and reimagines it as an opportunity for non-admitted students to take courses from Stanford for credit through a hybrid model that is offered through a partnership with their local schools, a nonprofit called the National Education Equity Lab, which helps us run this title school network, and Stanford faculty. And the model is that we bring together teaching fellows who are trained Stanford undergrads, grad students, and alums, faculty, and then local teachers in the school. And we offer this hybrid course experience that has combinations of face-to-face and online, and it has combinations of synchronous and asynchronous learning that gives students a fantastic college course, the chance to learn, rigorous material that is, on the book, same learning outcome, same rigor as what we offer on campus, and to do it for credit that has both moral currency, psychological currency, and financial currency for them. And it's kind of a boost for them, for their academic aspirations, for their growth mindset, and also for their social capital, because it turns out, those teaching fellows from Stanford are some of the best ambassadors of the university that we can send out into the world. They become near peer connectors. They themselves report that it's the most meaningful thing they've done at Stanford in the past year. Most of them say that. And so it's kind of a projection of Stanford knowledge not just to the world generally, but specifically to low-income high schools, where we know from the data that the most talented students never even show up on the admissions radar
Hmm.
of selective colleges. The majority of the most talented low-income students in the US never apply to any selective college. And that's research that was done here at Stanford. It's sometimes called undermatching. That's a kind of a jargon term, but it's basically a gap in that, you know, that system between the K-12 and higher education system. That question that you asked me at the beginning,
Hmm.
this is one of the critical gaps, that low-income students are under-counseled, under-advised, and they're not told that if you applied to Stanford, you'd get in and you'd get full financial aid. And so they opt out of that system. And our message is we want those students to not just, be identified, but we want to cultivate that talent. We want to give them opportunities to learn with us, to demonstrate their potential and to grow their potential. And so, that's kind of the model that we've designed to reach upstream into that earlier system, to the precursors and, junior and senior year of high school, and give opportunities in communities that have never had a model of dual enrollment from any selective college, let alone Stanford.
Man, I have so many questions for you. When you talk about mission driven innovation, you think about the selectivity of a R1 or the selectivity of a private or an Ivy and this public good. How, as people are listening and thinking about maybe their own institutions, how do you create change management in a way, or how do you create opportunities to help others prioritize this public good in midst of everything else the university is working on? I guess that's just a question I'm thinking about as I'm seeing how you've done it so
Yeah,
successfully
it's a great
at
question.
Stanford.
And I think the answer is probably different at different institutions. So I would hesitate to tell somebody, to just use our model. I think the goal is to find kind of synergies between the private interests of the institution and the public good, and to redefine those as a positive sum game rather than a zero sum game. So, when I say that our teaching fellows report that co-teaching in our program is the most meaningful thing they've done, that's me hunting for those opportunities for our own matriculated students to benefit and to learn. Our faculty love the program too. I now have a backlog of faculty who want to work with us. So you can't, I think enlightened self-interest is the framework. It's not absolute altruism. Institutions, organizations don't act out of altruism. Enlightened self-interest means that sometimes what is in the public interest is also in our interest if we understand that interest properly. Your job as an innovator is to go hunting for the right sources of that interest and the right partners, both outside and inside, and to be the enabler and the broker who uncovers those opportunities for creating shared value.
As I think about this last year and a half as we've come out of the pandemic and many institutions are trying to redefine the value proposition of higher education, I think this example and case study really hits the heart of this opportunity to really be able to meet students where they are. And I think the term you used was finding undermatched students who really should be in our institutional settings. And so I want to ask a little bit more about your partnership with, I think you said it's the National Education Equity Lab.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about the importance of that partnership with Stanford and how that partnership came to be?
Absolutely. So I think doing partnerships is also a key innovation strategy, just getting better at it and curating them and letting good organizations in and keeping the bad ones out. Like
Mm.
that's a really important role for those of us who sit kind of on the margins of the institution and can open the gates, not completely, but thoughtfully, to the right allies who share our goals. So the National Education Equity Lab is a startup nonprofit organization led by a terrific education reformer, former Obama administration education official. Her name is Leslie Kornfeld. And they help us, they bring these students to us. So they help run the network of schools. And, they're recruiting, Stanford and other great universities. And we help them bring universities onto this network to create a kind of many to many two-sided marketplace. You could think about it. It's not a market in the conventional sense. So it's not a for-profit model, but there's kind of universities that want to offer courses and high schools that want to receive them and offer them to their students. And they're the intermediary that's helping to set this up. And they've been a great ally for us. And I think we, in great institutions, need to find more allies. We need more friends. We need to
Yes,
work
we do.
better, with one another and also with the nonprofit community-based organization sector, the civil society sector. And we have an important role in attaching our own credibility to models like this and saying, this is valid, this is worthwhile. And since we have joined many other institutions, I just heard Vanderbilt last week signed an MOU with them. They look to us and they say, if Stanford's doing it, we can too. And I think that's another important innovation, phenomenon. You can sort of use the isomorphism and some of the herd dynamics of higher education for better,
Yes.
and like that's kind of we look to peer institutions. So that's just a reality that can hurt or it can help, and use that for good. Use that factor as a possibility for scale and for building a movement and for influencing our peers.
I love all of this. And before we move on, I just would love to hear a little bit about the cohorts that you've had so far. What do you know about the students that have come through your program? Do they end up in your pipeline? Like, how much information do you know, and how are you measuring the impact?
So that's a great question. We do track the impact, and there's a study with Robert Balfans, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins, who's longitudinally tracking like what happens to these students. 7 of them are now undergraduates here at Stanford. Just this week, I actually got to see 2 of them, a freshman and a junior here. 2 women, fantastic students. One of them is from rural New Mexico reservation, a community that's never sent a student to Stanford since our founding in 1891, since the reservation was established. She's the first, not just in her family, but her entire community to ever come here. And yeah, that was incredible. And the other one is from urban LA and South Central LA. And, just I mean, that's part of it is, bring the students to Stanford. But it's undermatching is not going to be solved by Stanford. Like the research shows, it's like about 35,000 students per year who are in that category of the top 10 percentiles of grades and test scores who never apply to any selected college. We only have 1,700 seats in our freshman class, so we can't do that on our own. So like that's why we're thinking in this kind of consortium collective way. And so we've sent students to Columbia and Princeton, like all the other great universities and all the state flagships as well. You and I have some, North Carolina connections. I previously worked at the University of North Carolina system. So, I understand, that's actually where you can really address the undermatching challenge, because that's where most of the seats are. They're in state flagships. So if you can raise a student's sights to go to a state flagship that they might not otherwise thought they could get into, that would have financial aid for them, that's a win for us. We call that the assist. We set you up. We don't have to score all the baskets. We got 7 baskets. That's wonderful. Students coming here, but that's not commensurate with a challenge of 35,000 per year. We all need to play the game of assists. We all need to pass the ball. And if you play this like a team sport, I think you could actually chip away at that challenge of undermatching. The whole Ed Equity Lab network, I think we'll have 15,000 students enrolled this academic year. So that's starting to get into the right order of magnitude to address this challenge. Meanwhile, it's not just about that top 10 percentiles for me. We bring whole cohorts of students from a school. We don't do individual lone geniuses. I don't believe in that. What we ask schools to do is to send a whole class and a teacher that take the course together. And I think that there's important metacognitive lessons in the team dynamic within the school, in the learning community that you can build, the supportive, collaborative opportunities to help one another, to tutor one another, to coach one another. So we're not looking for like just individuals. We're looking for cohorts. And I think there's an important democratic educational role in investing in kind of building capacity for the teacher and for the school, not just plucking individual geniuses out and sending them to a boarding school or bringing them to Stanford for the summer. There are many talent search programs that do that, and I don't believe in that at all. Like, what we want to do is embed it in the school that lifts up a whole class together.
So I love this because what I hear you talking about is really being able to resource communities and really being
Exactly.
able to provide opportunities not just for the best and the brightest, but to lift all sails at the same
But who
time.
knows what the best and brightest even means? They're sophomores in
Yes,
high school,
that's right.
and like talent sometimes just is not recognized
And it takes
by.
a while
If it's
sometimes.
exactly, some of it needs to be cultivated and supported. And if you don't believe you have it, you might not be showing up for your teacher. So
Yeah.
that's, we need to stay humble. I think, standardized testing is a form of arrogance. It says like, oh, we can find that genius in the cradle. If you just
Yeah.
had the right test, we
Yeah.
would know in the womb who's going to be
Yes.
the next. Forget that.
Yeah.
The geniuses are made; they're not born.
That's
And
right.
like so, our role is not about geniuses necessarily. It's about communities. It's about building more collective models that create opportunity for everyone, even as we are, participating in, this elective meritocratic system. It
Mhm.
needs a counterbalance. It needs a democratic counterbalance, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think those, they're often in tension, but part of what the magic of digital learning offers is that we can take a more abundant approach to learning. It doesn't have to be scarce the way it was in the past. There's opportunities to share and to democratize education without harming the highly selective undergraduate admissions or graduate admission system that prevails here and at our peer institutions. And the place is still doing just fine. And we can still enroll thousands of non-matriculated students and offer them credit. And it hasn't harmed anything. If quite the contrary, it has only benefited Stanford and its own community.
As I listen to you talk about college pathways and dual enrollment and really investing in communities and the innovation work, I'd love to understand. You talked about the research happening at Johns Hopkins, the longitudinal research. If there are other research studies, and as you're looking around this landscape and thinking about these innovations, are there other ways that if people are not prepared or ready as an institution to be a provider of dual credit or have all the institutional pieces together, are there other ways that you see people are leaning in and really starting to think about this public good and really
Yeah,
starting to raise up communities?
absolutely. So I look to organizations like Texas On-Ramps as a model for how a state flagship can invest in pathways. It's a profound innovation that I think many state systems and state flagships could replicate. And in fact, I learned recently that the University of Illinois is replicating that model in a statewide strategy with support from the American Talent Initiative, Aspen Institute. They just put out a release led by Lisa Anderson, who I'm proud to say is an alum of our team. She's the digital learning leader at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She's driving kind of a statewide model for working with teachers to support college pathways through college level coursework that's embedded in schools. So, we have not perfected this approach. It's far from a monopoly. What we're trying to do is like build networks of mission driven educational improvement and change. And and that's just, we're just at the beginning. There's so many different ways that you could approach this. I've learned more recently about college advising and counseling, and there's all sorts of interesting innovations that are happening in that space, kind of using digital to connect undergraduates to high schoolers to build more effective relationship based counseling. There's a nonprofit that has a chapter at Stanford called Matriculate,
Mm-hmm.
um, that is led by students who are assigned to four high schoolers who have to meet a set of criteria, GPA and recommendation criteria. And then they get this intensive 1-to-4 ratio of near peer college counseling. They don't have that. Most schools, have like 1-to-400 ratios, not 1-to-4 ratios for a professional counselor. Every college or university could have a chapter of Matriculate with a little bit of support that enables your students to kind of represent you and to support low income college pathways. Doesn't require coursework, doesn't it's like this is on the administrative side, not the academic side of college admissions. But taking on the FAFSA is no joke.
Yeah.
If you've never, approached it, if your parents didn't go to college,
Yeah.
and
Even
people
before the
need a lot of
changes.
help.
Even before all of
Exactly.
the changes.
Exactly. And it's exactly, we should simplify it for everybody, but it's still, a process. And if you're the first in your family to go to college, you need help. And and schools aren't always set up for that. So like that's a role that I see institutions playing. Enable your students to participate in programs like that and support it and join. Matriculate has like a membership model for institutions to join in. And we did that recently in collaboration with our admissions office. and our Haas Center for Public Service, and that's been fantastic. So yeah, there's so many different approaches that I think are exciting. Like, but to me, the key is like point the innovators at these challenges, focus on these audiences, and if you don't think about them, if you think your job is just serving working professionals, you've missed the biggest
Yeah.
opportunity for serving the underserved learners. It's fine to serve working professionals, but only a third of adults have a degree. So if you're
Yeah.
focusing on people who already have a degree, what about the rest of our society?
Good
And
point.
that to me is that is a missing piece of most strategies, most digital
Yeah.
learning strategies.
What do you say to folks who are turning away from looking at high school students as a main opportunity for enrollment because the numbers, the enrollment numbers are dwindling in terms of the numbers of students who are graduating from high school
Hmm.
and moving into higher ed? Like, how do we get people to change the narrative of those kinds of conversations?
Yeah, I mean the I'm sure your listeners know like the demographic research from Nathan
Hmm.
Gra, like, and they're the clearinghouse numbers this year that show that first year enrollments are down. Although
Yeah.
I understand there's typically an adjustment a few months later. So, but before you know worrying too much about a headline of 5% decline, like we should wait a couple of months and see what the adjusted numbers are. But yeah, at the UNC system, when I was there, we focused on some college, no degree as the main online audience. And we were building online undergraduate programs that were intended to serve those who had stopped out and supporting their pathways back to college. And I think that's for online strategies in public universities, that makes a lot of sense. The some college, no degree population, I think now exceeds 40 million.
It's huge.
When I
It's
was
huge.
there, 10 years ago,
Hmm.
it was in the 30 millions. I don't remember the
Yeah.
exact number. So like that to me is it's a critical challenge. There are great organizations that are helping with that too. There's one called Re-Up, which helps institutions kind of re-enroll those who stopped out. And there are many innovators in that space. Like UNC Charlotte built a program that was focused on the city of Charlotte, and it was an information campaign. It was around destigmatizing returning to college and kind of resetting your sights, like a second chances model. And I love that. So yeah, I think like online undergraduate programs, historically have been oriented towards adult learners. The first time student population actually also continues to grow online. Like they also want online courses. So it's not instead of at this point. But I think most selective institutions have focused on master's degrees,
Hmm.
but there's now a lot more movement in bachelor's degrees for adults. Cornell University recently approved an online bachelor's program. The faculty approved it a couple of weeks ago.
Which is
That
fantastic to
that
hear.
that is a monument. It's a
Yes.
huge achievement. At the University of Pennsylvania, in the School of Arts and Sciences, so like the core liberal arts part of the University of Pennsylvania, they have an online bachelor's program that I believe enrolls 1 out of 7 Penn undergrads. That is
Oh,
an
wow.
immense achievement in the context of a highly selective institution in the
Hmm.
arts and sciences heart of the university. They built an online bachelor's success story that is for adults. So we need more examples like that.
We do.
I so admire institutions that have moved in that direction. And like it or not, those places kind of like set a certain standard for the entire system. They give permission to the rest of the sector to act. When they act that way, they give permission to the rest of us to act. That is exciting.
I love when you said something to the phrase of, using the headwinds for good, really
Yeah,
thinking about some of the selective institutions that have the opportunity to really change the narrative of where higher education is going and change
exactly.
the narrative and stigma that we historically put on underrepresented populations, we've put on online education, digital
Yeah,
learning, right? Like we've just changed the narrative
exactly.
drastically around these
Yeah.
topics. So
That is part of the privilege of working at a place like this.
yeah.
It's that there is people look to us for leadership, and what we do influences the strategies of other institutions. Use that power for good,
Yeah.
while you have it in the short amount of time that you get to work at these institutions that last hundreds of years. So use it, use the platform to share what we have, you know.
I appreciate that. So, Matthew, what's next for you? What's next for the work that you're leading at Stanford?
So we have a new president at Stanford who's put out a very exciting mandate in his inauguration speech that's focused on expanding access to learners worldwide. And the vision is that there's an order of magnitude more learners around the world who could benefit from a Stanford education compared to when President John Levin, was an undergraduate here in the early 90s. That's an exciting challenge for us to take on, especially in the context of a deglobalization and a return to nationalism and protectionism, which he also addresses in his speech. And we are trying to figure out like how to do that and what that means. And there's a lot of exciting ideas, I think, that are emerging from this community with a mandate to kind of reimagine a global strategy. It's not predicated on global campuses necessarily, but uses all the digital and human capital tools at our disposal to provide more educational opportunity to those who could benefit from it around the world. I published a piece recently about an emerging open education strategy that we call living textbooks.
Hmm.
And it's kind of a reimagination of the textbook as an open source project. There's now 3 or 4 of them that have come organically from Stanford faculty. They're built generally on GitHub, which is a
Okay.
platform for open source collaboration.
Yes.
And many of them have a combination of content and code, so there's a kind of quantitative component that benefits from having kind of digital first representation, but they also have print representations, and many of the more progressive university presses are willing to do peer review and to produce a print version of these books that can live alongside an open source digital version of the book. So it's not like a PDF EPUB that you would download. It's an active kind of living, breathing open source community that people can respond to, and they can fix problems, and they can translate it and repurpose it and globalize it, because the content that we produce here could be valuable in other parts of the world. GitHub unusually is open in China. Many other community generated platforms are blocked in China,
Mm,
but because it's the foundation of open source collaboration, even China, which is kind of closing its technological borders, remains open to that one. So and many of the challenges around previous open educational concepts were around kind of technological sustainability. And the idea is that if we don't worry too much about the technological layer, just like use the existing technology collaboration platforms that are out there, but instead think about the content and application layer and the implementation, like the supporting community colleges and using, content that we create and building courses of their own based on it. Like that's actually higher value adding, and it reduces some of the technological burden and the challenges that other open source projects or open education projects have faced in the past. So I'm excited about that. I wrote a piece recently about it. And I loved like when you find organic faculty movement. Like we didn't tell anybody to do this. I just did some pattern recognition. I was like, oh, this is happening in the psychology department. And then here in the Door School of Sustainability, there's another group of faculty who want to do one of these. Like, put them together, document it, and then see if we can get more, build a service around it.
that's
So
right.
so it's I think that is another. You were asking about innovation strategy. That's another one. Just listen to what the innovators are already doing, and figure out how you can unblock the next ones who want to do more of what they're doing.
I just really always appreciate talking with you. I always leave inspired. I always leave with new information, new opportunities to think about the work that we both love and have just committed our lives to. I know listeners, we've given a lot of information here. Matthew's giving you a lot of opportunities to think about this work. We'll do our due diligence and make sure that we note all of this in the show notes. Matthew, thank you so much for the time.
Thank
Really great
you.
to see you. Is there any
Likewise.
lasting comment that you want the listeners to be able to take away before we close out this episode?
We have a newsletter that I would love people to sign up for, and we'll link to that as well. We are open, and I think we love hearing from readers. I respond. I read. I respond. Social media, email. We want to be engaged in these questions, and so I encourage your listeners to reach out. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be with you and to engage more in the future.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank our listeners as well. Thank you for being our dedicated listeners and curious educators everywhere. Remember to follow us on social media. You can find us on X, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook at D2L, and subscribe to the D2L YouTube channel. You can also sign up for the Teaching and Learning Studio email list for the latest updates on new episodes, articles, masterclasses. And if you like what you've heard, remember to rate us, give us a review, share the episode, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss anything. Bye for now. You've been listening to Teach and Learn, a podcast for curious educators brought to you by D2L.
To learn more about our K through 20 and corporate solutions, visit d2l.com. Visit the Teaching and Learning Studio for more material for educators by educators, including masterclasses, articles, and interviews.
And remember to hit that subscribe button. And please take a moment to rate, review, and share the podcast. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, school's out.